So it's finally time for you to purchase a concealed carry pistol, and the question you have is, which one should I get? Today I'm going to be comparing two of the most popular options and often the ones that I recommend to a lot of people, and hopefully give you a better understanding of which one you might choose. So the two that come to mind is this one, which is the X-Macro. This is from SIG Sauer, as well as the Glock 48, which are both really great options and have very similar features. But again, when it comes to preference, you might pick one over the other. Now, I'm going to tell you, I'm not someone who sticks into the category of one brand is always better than the other. I am more of a product-specific person, which means sometimes a big brand might make a good product, and sometimes the other brand might make a good product as well, and it just comes down to user preference. So regardless of which one of these you choose, I think they're both going to be great options. I'm going to leave links in the description to all the products we're going to try to speak about. If I forget anything, please make sure to let me know. And we're going to cover, again, the pros and cons of each and see what might be better for you. So first, let's talk about the dimensions, the features that they come with, and see what we're able to compare. So in regards to sizing, the length of the X-Macro is 6.6 inches, and the length of the Glock 48 MOS is 7.28 inches. The height of the X-Macro is 5.2, while the Glock 48 is 5.04. The width of both of these pistols is exactly 1.1 inches. And then for the X-Macro, the weight comes in at 21.5 ounces, while the Glock 48 comes in at 20.6 ounces. So they're not very far apart in regards to dimensions of what they're offering. And again, when it comes to concealability, the thing that we're looking for is going to be the grip length. So the height of the X-Macro is just a little bit larger than the Glock 48, which theoretically means you'll be able to have a little bit more printing that might come out of the X-Macro versus the 48. Now, I'll tell you that based on your hand size, that could also help dictate which gun might be right for you. I'm generally wearing a size large glove, maybe a little bit larger in some cases. So for my hand, if I were to be able to get, let's say, the P365, which is kind of like the baby brother of the X-Macro, it doesn't feel like I have enough to grab for that pistol. So your hand size should also dictate what you're going to choose. Now, my opinion is you should never get a pistol that when you're holding it, your pinky is going to be just a little bit off the gun. If that happens, when you have the gun, your pinky a little bit off the gun, your recoil mitigation is going to be difficult because you're now trying to have control of the pistol while recoil is happening, but you don't have a pinky anymore to help with that, right? So if we're going to lift something heavy, I'm not going to lift something heavy like this. I want to use every finger I have available to really give me that control. Now here's where I'm starting to see some of the pros and cons of the Glock over the X-Macro. So right now, if we look at the Glock right over here, we have this area right over here, which is called the undercut, right? So a lot of people will actually create a double undercut where they'll actually remove a little bit of the plastic from this area and from this area. So when I grab the gun like this and wrap my hands like this, my hand is actually able to get up higher on the firearm, which might make it a little bit more comfortable. I didn't feel that I need to do any modification to the X-Macro because the X-Macro's design is that it looks like they actually made that bump from the factory a little bit higher. So when I grab this gun, I have much more control of the gun. I have much more grip on the gun than I do on the 48. And what you might notice on the 48 is I actually added this magwell, which I made a video on. This is the magwell from Empire Designs. And this was a really good magwell. It works really well. It doesn't create any issue with concealability because you see that the lip goes forward. So since that lip goes forward, then that angle is just going down like towards my pants. It's not becoming wider. So for printing, it's not really a problem. But what you can see that does is that you'll see how my pinky now has a shelf that it's able to rest on, which now makes it more comfortable to be able to hold. So without that, I still would be able to use the Glock perfectly fine, but it is much more comfortable to be able to use it with a magwell. And again, as you can see on the X-Macro, I didn't require that because since I still have additional space at the bottom over there, it still was able to work again without that being a need. So that was something that in regards to cost and additional modification, it wasn't necessary on the X-Macro. They are both optics ready, so you can see on both of these guns, I do have optics set up on them. They both have flashlights, again, so in that regard, they are the same. The Glock at the moment has more available modifications for the platform because Glocks are the #1 brand that people are going to manufacture for first before getting to any other brand. So right now, you'll be able to switch out a lot more on the Glock than you will on the X-Macro. However, the serialized component of the X-Macro and of the SIG line now is their trigger system. So the trigger itself of the gun, which is internal, obviously over here, that's going to be the part that's serialized. So what a lot of brands are doing now is they're making systems where you can remove that trigger mechanism and put it into different places and utilize it in different ways, which is really cool. So I think that in the very near future, you will have a lot more options available for the X-Macro than you will for the Glock. But at the moment, it seems that Glock still kind of overruns in that area. Now, that being said, since the trigger aspect of the X-Macro is the serialized component, that means if you want to modify your trigger, you won't be able to do so. As you can see on the Glock 48, the gun is obviously clear. I have a Overwatch precision trigger, which is a very flat, crisp break. Really, really nice trigger for the Glock 48. And then on the X-Macro, you pretty much get what you get from the factory. And in my opinion, the X-Macro grip and a lot of SIG's triggers are not really my favorite. They're a bit squishy. They feel like, I'm sure over time it's going to break in even more, but for what it is, I would prefer to be able to have the option to modify my trigger. Now, when it comes to legalities, you might like the X-Macro because from the factory with all the features that it comes with, there's not a lot you'll need to do in order for it to be a functional gun out of the box. Again, as a preference, I like modifying my Glock just because some things I felt were lacking. So another thing is from SIG, the grip, the actual grip module that comes from SIG is very grippy. It feels good. Versus the Glock 48, I felt the need to add Talon grips, which allow me to have a little bit more control of the recoil on the grip when I was using it. It's a little bit softer, the frame from factory. So again, pros and cons over there. Now, where things really change up is that the Glock from the factory, when you purchase it from the factory, we're not talking about additional modifications outside third-party companies or anything like that. From the factory, the Glock 48 has a 10-round magazine capacity versus if you're living in a free state, the X-Macro has a 17-round magazine capacity. For comparison, that is the same as a Glock 45 or a Glock 17, which is considered to be a duty gun. So if I were to compare these two right over here, so this being a Glock 45, and you can see the size of that, versus the X-Macro, you can see how much of a difference that actually makes in regards to sizing while still having a very large capacity. So for me, if I was living in a free state and I had the ability to have 17 rounds in a mag and carry a spare magazine as well, that is a huge amount of ammunition that's readily accessible to you, and I think that is incredible. Again, there are aftermarket companies that are making additional parts for Glock 48s where you can now hold 15 rounds. For example, the PSA Dagger, the PSA Micro Dagger now actually has a 15-round magazine capacity, also S15. However, from factory, when it comes to what you're purchasing with the gun, the X-Macro just immediately comes ahead. Now, there is also a price difference with the X-Macro when it comes to the magazines that you're going to be using because they are more expensive, so that's something worth considering as well when it comes to budget. But these are all just additional details that come in the pro and con category for the X-Macro versus the Glock 48. Now, when it comes to sights also, Glock is known that from factory, their sights are not good. They're kind of like placeholders until you get something better. Now, with that being said, on both my Glock and my SIG, I'm going to ultimately change the sights because when I add an optic, I like having my sights a little bit taller. So you can see on my Glock 48, I'm using the Ameriglow sights for the front and the rear, right? And that I'll be able to match up with the optic very well. On the SIG X-Macro, you can see that the sights for me are still a little bit too short for what I'm trying to do there, right? So I'm gonna actually have to replace that anyway. Now from the factory, brighter front sights. So it's much easier to pick up your sights when you're going to be using it, again, versus Glock, which is not ideal. So again, if you're looking for just staying stock from factory, there's going to be an advantage to the X-Macro because you're not spending the additional potential $150 on sights if you're not looking to necessarily get suppressor height. Again, for me, it doesn't really make a difference because regardless, I'm probably going to switch that out because I do like a little bit higher of a iron sight to be able to co-witness or just line up with the red dot that I'm going to be using. So now the question is, if I had right now only one option of which gun I would pick, which one would I choose? What I will tell you is this, in my opinion, you shouldn't have both. What I mean by you shouldn't have both doesn't mean you can't own both. Have as many guns as you want. But if you're going to carry one, I would say train on only one of them. And the reason why I'm saying this is because the big difference between Glock and SIG is that the grip angle of the gun is different. So the Glock angle is a little bit further back versus the X-Macro is a little bit straighter. It's almost closer to, I guess, what would be a 1911 style grip. Not exactly, but similar. So if you're going to practice on one system, you need to make sure that they're both consistent because the problem I've had was when I switched back and forth and I was training with them is that I now draw my Glock and everything's lined up. Then I draw my SIG and the front sight is much lower than I would expect because the grip angle is changing based on the grip angle of the actual gun. So whichever one you choose, do whatever you want, but stick consistent with whichever training method you're going to be using because you want to make sure that your presentation of the firearm will be consistent every single time. Now, that that being said, if I lived in a free state, considering the cost that I had to put into the Glock to make it what it is, I would personally choose the X-Macro. It is a great gun. It has all of these great features. It has a 17-round magazine capacity. It's still very modular with more modularity coming from different third-party companies in the future. And I think is a great overall option when it comes to concealed carry. Now, my hand size also fits the gun very well, which means if your hand is a little bit smaller, you live in a restricted state, which means you're limited to 10 rounds anyway when it comes to the use of the gun, then having the Glock 48 is an excellent option. You could also add the magwell. Again, if you live in a restricted state like I do, I could add the magwell, which costs a little bit more, but it gives me that additional shelf to be able to have a little bit more control of the recoil and be able to have a little bit better grip on the gun, and it also works fine. So again, they're both great options. I really do like, and I've been training a lot more with the X-Macro based on the fact that it costs me a little bit less to fully set up, plus being able to get the features that I need to run the gun without additional modification. I think it works really well. You don't need to get the comp like I did on the front, but again, if it's something you wanted to try, I think it works really well, and I think it's a great option. And again, for something that would kind of do a dual style option, I think the X-Macro is a great option. If you have any questions or if you need any links, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. This is Raziel Cohen with ndftraining.com. Thank you for watching.